Hey guys, so really in your second lesson here in biology, it's only fitting that we talk about what biology actually means. And biology, of course, is the study of life. And life actually has a specific meaning, a specific definition, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this lesson. So according to your textbook, there are 8 characteristics or 8 features that all living organisms or all life have in common with each other. Now, depending on what source you use to look at what we call these quote-unquote characteristics of life, you might find different things, but your textbook uses 8, so we'll talk about those 8 features that all living organisms share in the next few slides, starting with what we have in front of us. According to your textbook, the first characteristic of life, that all living things are composed of cells. Now, these are cells. Now, this picture shows multiple cells, but the one that I've highlighted here in red, which is just like the one that's stacked underneath it, which is very similar to the one that's stacked underneath it, those all represent multiple different cells that make up the slide of this organism that we're looking at. So this is what we would call a multicellular organism, but there are also living things that just are one single cell big. So there are living things out there that are just one cell big, and those are called unicellular organisms. But in general, guys, all living things must be made of at least one of these cells, because a cell is defined as the building block of all living organisms. A cell is the smallest self-contained unit of life, which is why we call a cell the building block of all life, because all living things at their fundamental level are made of at least one of these units called cells. Here we see the second characteristic of life as described by your textbook, and that is that all living things have the ability to make more living things. In other words, all living things can reproduce. Now, there are 2 types of reproductive strategies employed by living organisms across the planet. One form of reproduction is called asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction means that only one parent, one original organism, is necessary in order to create brand new life, to create new organisms. So asexual reproduction is reproduction that takes place without sex. Therefore, only one parent is required, but still multiple new organisms or new offspring can be generated. This is an example of this mama duck right here and all of her baby ducklings. And ducks are an example of organisms that reproduce using a different strategy known as sexual reproduction. In other words, this mom and some mysterious dad duck, who is not currently shown in this picture, reproduced sexually. So 2 parents reproduced to make all of these brand new forms of life. All of these babies, all of these ducklings came from, in this case, sexual reproduction. So regardless of if the organisms reproduce asexually, where only one parent is needed, or if they reproduce sexually, where 2 parents are needed, the bottom line here is that all life forms have the ability to make more life forms, but different strategies are used. We'll talk about those different strategies later on in the year, as long as you understand right now the second feature of life is the ability to reproduce. Here we see both the third and the fourth characteristic of life all on one slide, because they're kind of similar. And these are ones that, if your textbook has 8 characteristics of life, some other sources might have 7. Here's why: because sometimes these 2 get combined together. But for your textbook, here's your third and your fourth characteristic of all living organisms. So your textbook says that the third characteristic of life is genetic inheritance. In other words, all living things pass physical traits on to their future generations because of this very special, very intricate, and very complicated molecule right here known as DNA. So all living things have this DNA molecule that allows them to pass characteristics on to future generations. That's the third characteristic of life, containing DNA and being able to pass heritable traits onto offspring. The fourth characteristic of life, as shown right here in this diagram, the life cycle of a frog, is that all living organisms throughout their life, in some manner, show patterns of growth and of development. Growth meaning some sort of physical change in size, and development meaning the addition or possibly removal of various physical features. So a frog is a great example of that, because here we have lots of little frog babies starting out as eggs, and then we see those eggs moving to embryos, then into tadpoles, and then we have these various anatomical changes that are occurring all the way up to the adulthood of this frog. So not only is that frog obviously increasing in size, but we go from various physical features like this tadpole having a fish-like tail and still having that fish-like tail here, but then starting to lose that tail here, and then obviously there's no tail here on an adult frog. Or the idea that tadpoles breathe and obtain oxygen, very similarly to fish, using gills, whereas adult frogs will use a set of lungs. So not only do we have physical growth, but we also have development, meaning that the frog is changing over the course of its life, as well as growing, as well as actually getting physically larger. So containing DNA and growing and developing over the course of a life, those are your third and fourth characteristics all living organisms share. And here we have the fifth. As defined by your textbook, all living organisms undergo metabolism. Let's talk about metabolism. Metabolism is the sum or the accumulation of all of the chemical processes internally in a living organism that allow it to harvest materials and energy from one place and use those materials and energy in order to sustain their own life. So in this diagram here, we have three organisms. Okay, we have the grass. Don't forget, plants are organisms. Okay? We have the deer, which is eating the grass. And then we have our tiger, which probably eventually is going to go eat that deer. Okay? So not only do we have these three living organisms, but they are all showing this fifth characteristic of life, the ability to harvest and use various materials and energy sources or forms of energy in order to sustain their own life function. So let's talk about the original source of energy, big ball of gas, 93 million miles away from Earth, known as the sun. And that sun sends solar energy down to planet Earth, where it can be soaked up by, where that solar energy can actually be used by plants like this grass. Okay, that solar energy inside of the grass is being turned into a form of chemical energy, into sugar molecules and carbohydrate molecules that can be then consumed and used by other animals. So we have solar energy coming into the grass. The grass is changing that solar energy into chemical energy, and then we have the deer eating the grass. So the deer is now obtaining that chemical energy, and it's energy that the deer will use day in and day out to keep its life processes going. Okay? And then when the tiger gets hungry, that energy is moving then into the tiger. So we have solar energy moving from the sun to the grass. That grass makes chemical energy. The deer obtains that chemical energy by eating the grass, and the tiger obtains some of that chemical energy by eating the deer. So we have these energy transforming processes where grass, the deer, and the tiger, all three living organisms, are not only harvesting energy but transforming it into a useful state that they can use in order to sustain their own life processes. And once again, the sum of those processes, the sum of their reactions that is converting that energy, is known as metabolism. Here we have our sixth characteristic of life, and that is that all living organisms respond to their environment and interact with their environment, whether it's another living thing in their environment or whether it's a non-living thing in their environment. Okay? Here's an example of a reptile, a lizard, responding to its environment, because what's happening here is, once again, the sun shining down on Earth. Here we're not talking about the sun giving energy, here we're talking about the sun giving warmth, increasing temperature, and that's a non-living feature of an environment, temperature. That has nothing to do with life. It's a non-living component. However, the living lizard, this guy, is responding to the change in the environment. As the day gets warmer and possibly the lizard is looking to maybe hike up his body temperature a little bit, he's going to come lay out on the rocks, which have been warmed up by the sun, and he's responding to that change in the environment. He's responding to the day getting increasingly warmer by changing his behavior, altering his behavior to go lay still on a rock and warm himself up because of a change that's taking place in the environment. And we see this across all living organisms, that in one way or another they change in order, in response to changes that are occurring both in the living and the non-living portions of their own environment. All living organisms respond in some way to their environment that surrounds them. Aw, cute. Here we have our 7th characteristic of all living organisms, as displayed by everybody's man's best friend, this dog laying here in the backyard. And we all know that dogs, when they get hot, when they get exerted, they can't sweat like humans do, but they can maintain an internal body temperature. And the ability to maintain not only an internal body temperature, but to maintain just a stable internal environment that doesn't fluctuate too drastically in one direction or another is known as homeostasis. So the 7th characteristic of all living organisms is the ability to maintain homeostasis, keep that internal balance, keep conditions or environment inside of the living organism stable. Okay, so this dog, when it runs around and it plays fetch and its body temperature suddenly starts to spike, starts to go up, it will regulate that increase in body temperature by opening its mouth, sticking out its tongue, and panting. We've all seen dogs do this, and that releases some of that hotter temperature and helps the dog maintain homeostasis, or an internal state, and helps that dog maintain its internal body temperature. Okay? So just like this dog panting to release heat, all living things maintain homeostasis, which means they keep their internal conditions stable regardless of changes that are happening outside of themselves. And then lastly, we have the 8th characteristic of life, is shown by this insect here that looks very much like a leaf, and that is that all living organisms show a history of evolution. And guys, evolution is just defined as gradual changes to an entire species over very long periods of time. Thousands, if not millions of years have gone by where this insect gradually has arrived at this very unique shape and looking like a leaf. Okay, this didn't just happen overnight. This insect clearly shows a history of small changes over thousands and thousands and thousands of years to arrive at its current evolutionary status. And that is an insect that looks like a leaf so that it can avoid being eaten. So all living organisms, as the 8th characteristic of life, demonstrate in some way a very long history of slow and gradual changes that's known as evolution. So finally, your textbook is going to talk about not the features of life, but what we call the hierarchy of life, or how all life is organized from the smallest levels up to the largest levels. So we'll begin on the small end of things with things that are not considered living, atoms and molecules. Atoms build together to make molecules, but they are not considered to be living. In fact, the smallest living thing we've already learned is a cell. So here is the basic unit of life from which we can build the rest of our levels of organization. In your guys' textbook, the next level up from cell, it says groups of cells, but groups of cells include tissues, organs, and entire organ systems, which can then add together to make one organism. And when multiple organisms from the same species come together, they form a population. When multiple populations come together, they form a community. When communities come together and include non-living things like water and sunlight, we get an ecosystem, and then all portions of Earth that are capable of supporting life, land, water, and air, we call the top level the biosphere.